Harlem, 1952. A man walks into the 32nd Precinct Police Headquarters at 135th Street and Amsterdam Avenue. No lawyer, no bodyguard, no weapon. Just Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, wearing a charcoal gray suit that's seen better days, walking through the front doors of one of the most corrupt police stations in New York City like he owns the place. The desk sergeant looks up. His face goes pale. Within 3 hours, Bumpy Johnson will walk out of that building with something no black man in Harlem has ever received from the NYPD: a formal apology and an honorary detective's badge. This is the story of how one man turned the entire power structure of New York City upside down, using nothing but intelligence, patience, and the one thing corrupt cops fear more than anything: the truth. To understand what happened that day, you need to understand who Bumpy Johnson was. Not the legend, not the myth. The man born in Charleston, South Carolina in 1905, Bumpy came to Harlem during the Great Migration when he was just a teenager. By the 1930s, he was running numbers for Stephanie St. Clair, the legendary queenie of Harlem's policy racket. But Bumpy wasn't just muscle. He was a strategist. While other enforcers relied on violence and intimidation, Bumpy studied power. He read European history, studied military tactics, understood that real power comes from information and leverage, not fear. By 1952, he'd spent 11 years in various prisons: Sing Sing, Alcatraz, others, sent there by a system designed to break men like him. But prison didn't break Bumpy. It educated him. He came out sharper, smarter, more dangerous than when he went in. And he came out with a plan. The New York Police Department in the 1950s was a different beast than today. Corruption wasn't the exception. It was the standard operating procedure. Cops on the beat in Harlem took weekly envelopes from every numbers runner, every after-hours club, every business that wanted to operate without harassment. They called it protection money. The community called it extortion. The 32nd Precinct was the worst of them all. Captain James Harding ran it like his personal kingdom. He had 40 cops under his command, and every single one of them was on the take. They'd shake down legitimate businesses, plant evidence on anyone who complained, and beat confessions out of suspects in basement rooms where no one could hear the screaming. The black community in Harlem lived in constant fear of the police, not because the cops kept them safe, but because the cops were often more dangerous than the criminals. But here's what Captain Harding didn't know. For 6 months, Bumpy Johnson had been building a case against him, not with lawyers or official complaints. Those got buried or ignored. Bumpy built his case the old-fashioned way, with patience, observation, and an intricate network of people who owed him favors: shoeshine boys who overheard conversations, waitresses in cop bars who remembered which officers got drunk and bragged about their side income, bookkeepers who kept records of payments made and protection promised. Bumpy knew that dirty cops, like all criminals, have patterns. They get comfortable, sloppy, and Captain Harding had gotten very sloppy. The breaking point came on October 3, 1952. A 15-year-old kid named Marcus Williams was walking home from his job at a grocery store on Lenox Avenue. He had $43 in his pocket, his 2-week paycheck that he was bringing home to his mother. 2 cops from the 32nd, Officers Donovan and Riley, stopped him. They claimed they'd received reports of a robbery in the area, and Marcus fit the description. They took him into an alley. They took his money. And when Marcus protested, when he told them that was his paycheck and his mother needed it for rent, Officer Donovan hit him in the stomach with his nightstick hard enough to rupture his spleen. Marcus collapsed. The cops left him there. A shopkeeper found him 2 hours later, barely conscious, lying in his own blood. Marcus survived. Barely. He spent 3 days in Harlem Hospital. His mother, Sarah Williams, went to the 32nd Precinct to file a complaint. Captain Harding listened to her story with a face like stone, then told her that her son must have been mistaken, must have been different officers from a different precinct, maybe not officers at all, maybe criminals impersonating the police. He suggested that perhaps young Marcus had been involved in something he shouldn't have been, and this was the consequence. He suggested she go home and be grateful her son was alive. When Sarah Williams started crying, when she said she knew it was Donovan and Riley because Marcus had seen their badge numbers, Captain Harding's voice went cold. He told her that making false accusations against police officers was a serious crime. He suggested very carefully that she drop this matter before something happened to her other son, 10-year-old Jerome. That's when Sarah Williams did something desperate. She went to see Bumpy Johnson, not because she knew him personally, she was a church-going woman who'd never been involved in the street life, but because everyone in Harlem knew that Bumpy was the only man who'd stand up to corrupt authority. She found him at Small's Paradise on Saturday night. She walked right up to his table, where he was having dinner with three associates. The room went quiet. Women didn't interrupt Bumpy Johnson during dinner, but Sarah Williams was beyond caring about street protocols. She told him what happened to Marcus. She told him about Captain Harding's threat against Jerome, and then she said something that would echo through Harlem for decades. They think they can do anything to us because we got nobody. But you're somebody, Mr. Johnson. You're somebody they can't ignore. Bumpy looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood up, pulled out a chair, and told her to sit down. He ordered her a meal. She looked like she hadn't eaten in days, and while she ate, he asked questions. Precise questions. What time did it happen? Which alley? What exactly did the officers say? What were they wearing? Did Marcus see their badge numbers clearly? Could he describe their faces? Their voices? Any distinguishing features? Sarah answered everything. Bumpy listened with the intensity of a lawyer preparing for trial. When she finished, he reached into his pocket and pulled out $200. He told her that was for Marcus's medical bills and the rent she was about to lose. Then he said something that made Sarah Williams start crying again, but this time with relief. Mistress Williams, you're right. They think they can do anything because we're nobody to them. Time to remind them that we're not. What happened next was classic Bumpy Johnson. He didn't go to the police. He didn't go to the newspapers. They wouldn't print a story about a black kid beaten by white cops anyway. He didn't organize a protest or make speeches. He did what he always did. He gathered information. For 2 weeks, Bumpy's network went to work. They followed officers Donovan and Riley on their beats. They documented every shakedown, every envelope passed, every threat made. They tracked Captain Harding's movements, his habits, his associates. They discovered that Harding wasn't just taking bribes from Harlem businesses, he was running his own protection racket, squeezing legitimate operations for thousands of dollars a month. More than that, they discovered he was skimming from the NYPD evidence room, reselling confiscated drugs and weapons back onto the streets, through a fence in Brooklyn. But Bumpy didn't just gather evidence. He gathered leverage. He discovered that Donovan was having an affair with the wife of a city councilman. He discovered that Riley had a gambling problem and owed $15,000 to a bookmaker in Queens, debts he was paying off with money stolen from people like Marcus Williams. He discovered that Captain Harding had a vacation home in Connecticut that he purchased for $40,000 on the police salary of $6,000 a year, and most importantly, Bumpy discovered that the Commissioner of Police, Thomas Murphy, was starting to feel political pressure about corruption in Harlem. The mayor wanted results. The newspapers were starting to ask questions. Murphy needed to make an example of someone to save his own career. That's when Bumpy made his move. On October 21st, 1952, at exactly 9 a.m., He walked into the 32nd precinct. He was alone. He wore that same charcoal suit, carried a leather briefcase, and walked with the calm confidence of a man who held all the cards. The desk sergeant, a 20-year veteran named O'Sullivan, literally stood up when Bumpy walked in. Everyone in the precinct knew who Bumpy Johnson was. They knew he'd been released from Alcatraz 2 years earlier. They knew he was rebuilding his operations in Harlem. They knew he was someone you didn't cross lightly. O'Sullivan's hand moved toward his service weapon. Bumpy smiled, not threatening, just amused, and set the briefcase on the desk. His voice was calm, almost friendly. "I'm here to see Captain Harding. Tell him Bumpy Johnson is here to discuss the Marcus Williams matter. Tell him I have some documents I think he'll want to see. Tell him if he's smart, he'll see me in his office in the next 60 seconds. O'Sullivan stared at him. In the history of the 32nd precinct, no civilian had ever walked in and demanded to see the captain. Especially not a black civilian. Especially not a known criminal. For a moment, it looked like O'Sullivan was going to refuse, maybe even arrest Bumpy on some trumped-up charge. But something in Bumpy's eyes, some absolute certainty, made him pause. He picked up the phone, called up to Harding's office, mumbled something, hung up, looked at Bumpy with an expression somewhere between confusion and respect. "Captain says, come up, 2nd floor, but I'm watching you, Johnson." Bumpy's smile widened. "I'm counting on it, officer." Captain James Harding's office was exactly what you'd expect. American flag in the corner, commendations on the wall, photographs of Harding shaking hands with politicians and police brass. Harding himself was a large man, 6'2", 220 pounds, with the kind of face that looked perpetually angry. He sat behind his desk, with his arms crossed, trying to project authority. But Bumpy noticed the details, the slight tension in Harding's jaw, the way his eyes kept flicking to the briefcase, the fact that he'd positioned himself so he could quickly reach the gun in his desk drawer if needed. Harding spoke first, voice hard. "You've got some nerve walking in here. Johnson, give me one reason I shouldn't have you arrested right now for trespassing." Bumpy sat down without being invited. He opened the briefcase calmly, deliberately. He pulled out a thick folder and placed it on Harding's desk. Then he spoke, and his voice carried a weight that made even a police captain lean forward to listen. "Captain Harding, that folder contains documentation of every illegal payment you've received in the past 18 months. Dates, amounts, witnesses. It contains photographs of your vacation home in Connecticut, the one you bought with money you couldn't have earned legally. It contains testimony from 7 business owners you've been extorting, all willing to go on record. It contains evidence that you've been stealing from the NYPD evidence room and reselling contraband. And most importantly, it contains a detailed account of what Officers Donovan and Riley did to Marcus Williams on October 3rd, along with documentation of 14 other similar incidents involving your officers that were never properly investigated." The color drained from Harding's face. He reached for the folder with a hand that wasn't quite steady. As he opened it and started reading, Bumpy continued, voice never rising, never threatening, just stating facts with absolute confidence. "Now, you have 2 options, Captain. Option 1, I take this folder to Commissioner Murphy. I've already arranged a meeting with him for this afternoon. I bring Sarah Williams and her son, Marcus. I bring the other victims. I bring reporters from 3 newspapers who are very interested in this story. Your career ends, you get prosecuted, you probably go to prison, your officers get prosecuted, the 32nd precinct becomes a national scandal. Or..." Bumpy paused, letting the alternative sink in. Harding looked up, eyes desperate now. "Or what?" His voice cracked slightly on the words. Bumpy leaned back in his chair, completely relaxed, in total control. "Or you do the right thing. You formally apologize to Sarah Williams and Marcus Williams for what your officers did. You make a public statement taking responsibility for corruption under your command. You personally ensure that Donovan and Riley are terminated and prosecuted for assault and robbery. You implement reforms in this precinct. Real reforms, not window dressing. To protect the community you're supposed to serve. And as a gesture of good faith, as recognition that there are community leaders in Harlem who care about justice, Bumpy reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a police badge, setting it on the desk. You give me this honorary detective's badge, symbolically acknowledging that the community has a right to police itself and hold you accountable. The silence in that office stretched out like a held breath. Harding stared at the badge, stared at the folder, stared at Bumpy Johnson, this black man from Harlem who had just walked into a police station and, checkmate, a white police captain without raising his voice or making a single threat. Harding's hands were shaking now. He knew he was beaten. He knew that everything in that folder was probably true, and even if some of it wasn't, the appearance of corruption would be enough to destroy him. He knew that Bumpy Johnson had spent months building this case, gathering evidence that would hold up under scrutiny, and most terrifyingly, he knew that if Bumpy had this much on him, there was probably more that hadn't been shown yet. Finally, Harding spoke, a voice barely above a whisper. "If I do this, the folder disappears." Bumpy shook his head slowly. "No, I keep the folder, insurance. But as long as you keep your word, as long as real change happens in this precinct, it stays private. Break your word." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. 2 hours later, Sarah Williams and Marcus Williams were sitting in Captain Harding's office receiving a formal apology. Harding's voice was stiff, mechanical, but the words were there. Admission of wrongdoing, acknowledgement of the pain caused, commitment to justice. Marcus, still weak from his injuries, just stared at the man who'd covered up his beating. Sarah Williams cried again, but these were different tears. The tears of someone who, Bede believed the system would never listen, finally being heard. After they left, Bumpy and Harding had one final conversation. Harding slid the honorary detective's badge across his desk. "I hope you're happy, Johnson. You've humiliated me. Humiliated my department." Bumpy picked up the badge, turned it over in his hands, catching the light. "Captain, I didn't humiliate you. You humiliated yourself by forgetting what that badge is supposed to mean. It's supposed to mean protection, justice, service. For everyone, not just the people who look like you or who can pay you off. You humiliated yourself by thinking you could beat a 15-year-old kid half to death and threaten his mother into silence. All I did was remind you that actions have consequences." Bumpy stood to leave. At the door, he turned back. "One more thing. Captain Marcus Williams wants to be a police officer when he grows up, despite everything that happened to him. He still believes in what the badge is supposed to represent. In 5 years, when he applies to the police academy, his application is going to get approved. And you're going to personally write him a letter of recommendation. Because that boy has more integrity in his broken body than most of your officers have in their entire careers." Harding's jaw tightened, but he nodded. What else could he do? Bumpy Johnson walked out of the 32nd precinct at 12:47 p.m. Word spread through Harlem faster than wildfire. The man had walked into police headquarters alone and walked out with an apology and a badge. It became instant legend. The aftermath rippled through Harlem for years. Officers Donovan and Riley were fired and prosecuted. Both served time for assault and robbery. Captain Harding implemented reforms. Community oversight boards, complaint procedures that couldn't be buried, requirements for officers to live in or regularly engage with the communities they policed. Some of it was genuine. Most of it was self-preservation. But it was more than had existed before. And Marcus Williams, true to Bumpy's prediction, he applied to the police academy. In 1957, he got accepted. Captain Harding, true to his word, wrote the recommendation letter. Marcus became one of the first black detectives in the NYPD. spending 30 years fighting the corruption he'd experienced firsthand. He kept a photograph on his desk throughout his entire career. Young Marcus standing next to Bumpy Johnson, both of them holding that honorary detective's badge. So what's the lesson here? What's the takeaway from this impossible story of a black gangster walking into a police station during Jim Crow and walking out victorious? It's this. Real power doesn't come from violence or intimidation or even from money. Real power comes from information, preparation, and the willingness to stand up when everyone else is afraid. Bumpy Johnson understood something that corrupt authorities always forget. Their power depends on secrecy, on victims staying silent, on communities being too scared to fight back. The moment someone refuses to be intimidated, the moment someone gathers evidence and builds leverage and demands accountability, the whole structure starts to crack. Bumpy didn't overthrow the system that day, but he proved it could be challenged. He proved that intelligence beats brute force. He proved that one person with patience and strategy can take on institutions that seem untouchable. And here's the question that should haunt us. How much has really changed? We like to think we've moved past the days when police could beat kids with impunity and threaten mothers into silence. But how often do we still see corruption protected, victims ignored, powerful institutions closing ranks against accountability? The tools might be different, the systems more sophisticated, but the fundamental dynamic remains. Authority figures who think they're above the law versus communities who refuse to accept that reality. What would you have done in Sarah Williams's position? Would you have had the courage to walk up to Bumpy Johnson and ask for help? What would you have done if you were Bumpy? Would you have risked everything to help a kid you didn't know? Or would you have stayed quiet, stayed safe? Let the system grind on. These questions matter because the story isn't really about Bumpy Johnson. It's about what one person can do when they refuse to accept injustice. It's about the power of preparation, of documentation, of building a case so thorough that even corrupt authorities can't dismiss it. It's about understanding that the law isn't always justice, and sometimes justice requires working outside the system to force the system to do what it should have done all along. That's the real legacy of October 21st, 1952. Not that a gangster beat the cops, but that a community found its voice through someone brave enough to speak truth to. Power. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about power, justice, and how we hold authorities accountable, leave a comment below. Tell me, would you have walked into that police station? What would your strategy have been? And hit that subscribe button for more stories about the legends who refused to accept the world as it was and fought to make it what it should be. Because these stories aren't just history. They're blueprints for how ordinary people can challenge extraordinary corruption. They're reminders that the system only seems unchangeable until someone changes it.